strangest thing about being wrong is that it almost never feels that way. You do not wake up one morning and think, today I am going to defend something I should have abandoned months ago. You do not sit down at the table and decide, I will keep going even though the signs have been pointing elsewhere for a long time now. It does not happen like that. It happens quietly in the space between what you know and what you are willing to feel. And in that space, a very specific kind of reasoning takes over, one that does not announce itself, does not ask permission, and does not wait for you to notice it is there. The people who study error for a living have found something that should disturb us all. The more invested someone is in a decision, the harder it becomes to see the decision clearly. Not because they are less intelligent, not because they are less honest, but because the mind has already done the math, and the math is not about what is true. The math is about what it would cost to admit the truth. That is the thing that tends to go unspoken. We talk about mistakes as if the problem were information, as if people keep going down the wrong road because they simply do not have the map. But most of the time, they have the map. They are just holding it upside down because turning it right side up would mean admitting they have been walking in the wrong direction. And that, somehow, feels worse than the road itself. Think about what happens when you commit to something, not just in your calendar or your budget, in yourself. In the story you start telling, first to others, then slowly, almost without noticing, to yourself. You put time into something, and then because you put time into it, it starts to matter more. You defend it a little more, you explain it a little more carefully. You become a little more impatient with the people who do not seem to understand. At some point, and this is the part that almost no one sees while it is happening, the thing you are defending is no longer just the decision. It is the version of yourself that made the decision. It is the identity that was built on top of that choice, one small justification at a time. And once identity is in the picture, the rules change completely. Because now, questioning the path is not just questioning a direction. It is questioning the person who chose that direction. It is touching something that feels far more fundamental than a mistake. It feels like a verdict, and the mind, that restless, endlessly creative instrument, does not sit still in the face of a verdict. It argues, it searches for evidence. It finds exactly what it was looking for, because it knows where to look. There is a kind of internal accountant that lives in all of us, and this accountant does not follow the logic of future outcomes. It follows the logic of what has already been spent. The more you have given to something, time, money, emotional energy, the story of who you are, the more your inner accountant resists the idea of closing the account. Not because closing it would be wrong, but because closing it at a loss feels different in the body, in the chest, in the quiet part of the mind that counts things without words from closing it at a gain. And that difference, that asymmetry between what a gain feels like and what a loss feels like, is one of the most powerful and least visible forces in human decision-making. This is not a personality flaw. This is not stubbornness in the moral sense. This is something closer to the structure of how the mind calculates what it stands to lose. And what it almost always miscalculates is this. The cost of staying is often much higher than the cost of leaving. But the cost of leaving is immediate, visible, and personal, while the cost of staying is slow, abstract, and easy to defer to tomorrow. There is a woman, no name needed because you may recognize her anyway, who spent 3 years building something that she knew, in a quiet corner of herself, had stopped working around month 14. She could feel it, not dramatically, not in one clear moment, but in the way a room slowly gets colder when the heat has been off for too long. Little things. The conversations that used to energize her started to exhaust her. The clarity she once had about where she was headed began to blur, and she compensated by working harder as if speed could substitute for direction. She told herself it was a difficult phase. She told herself all meaningful things go through difficult phases. She told herself she had come too far to stop now. And that last sentence, I have come too far to stop now, is the one that deserves the closest attention, because it sounds like resilience. It sounds like commitment, like the kind of persistence that gets celebrated in every story about people who did not give up. But there is a question hiding underneath it, a question that almost no one stops to ask out loud. Too far according to what? According to the distance already traveled, or according to the distance still ahead? These are not the same question. The first looks backward, at the investment already made. The second looks forward, at what is actually left to gain. And most of the time when someone says, I have come too far to stop, they are answering the first question while pretending to answer the second. They are using the past to justify the future. And the past, for all of its weight, cannot justify anything about the future. The past is gone. What remains is only what comes next. She did not stop at month 14. She did not stop at month 20. She stopped at month 36, when the account had grown so heavy that setting it down was no longer a choice between staying and leaving. It was a choice between leaving and collapsing. And even then, even as she finally walked away, there was a part of her that felt not relieved, but like she had failed. Not at the thing itself, at the story. at the version of events that had required her to be the person who did not quit. The mind does not experience facts the way a spreadsheet does. A spreadsheet accepts new data and recalculates. The mind does something quite different. It filters incoming data through the conclusions it has already reached, and it does this so smoothly, so seamlessly, that the filtering is almost impossible to detect from the inside. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it changes the nature of the problem entirely. The common assumption is that if you give someone better information, they will make better decisions. And sometimes this is true. But there is a category of situation, larger than most people realize, where better information does not improve the decision, because the decision has already been made, and the information that arrives afterward is sorted by the mind into two piles. The pile of things that confirm what was already believed, and the pile of things that do not, and are therefore filed under doubt, exception, or someone else's agenda. When a belief is tied to identity, when being wrong would mean being someone you are not ready to be, incoming information does not get a fair hearing. It gets a trial, and the jury has already been selected. The mind brings forward all the evidence that fits. It questions the source of the evidence that does not. It finds reasons. It is extraordinarily good at finding reasons. The more intelligent the person, some research suggests, the more creative and elaborate those reasons tend to be. So the problem is not that people lack the ability to update. The problem is that updating when something important is at stake carries a price, and the price is not intellectual. It is emotional. It is the feeling of loss, the feeling of having been in some sense wrong about yourself. And the mind, which has spent considerable energy building a coherent story about who you are and why you do what you do, will spend at least as much energy protecting that story from information that would require rewriting it. This is how you can know something and still not act on what you know, not because the knowledge is absent, but because the knowledge has arrived somewhere the mind has already barricaded. If you found yourself pausing on any of this, if something here feels closer than you expected, consider staying close to this channel. There are more of these patterns to look at, and they tend to look different the second time you see them. Here is something that rarely gets mentioned when we talk about why people continue in directions that are not working. They are almost never doing it alone. The people around us are not neutral observers. They are participants in the same story. And what the story requires of them, what the social air of a group almost always produces, without anyone deciding to produce it, is confirmation. Not because they are dishonest. Because confirmation is what belonging often looks like from the outside. To validate the person next to you, to reflect their choices back to them with warmth and recognition, is one of the most natural forms of care that humans offer each other. But there is a shadow side to this. When the group becomes a mirror, it stops being a window. And the difference between a mirror and a window is the difference between seeing yourself and seeing what is actually out there. Groups that do not create genuine safety, the kind of safety where a person can say this is not working without fearing they will be seen as weaker, less capable, less committed, do not create it by accident. They fail to create it by default. The default of most environments is a kind of polished silence around the difficult things, a shared agreement, never spoken aloud, that certain observations are not welcome because they would require the group to look at something uncomfortable together. And so the person who is on the wrong path finds themselves surrounded by people who are, without meaning to, helping them stay on it. Not through bad intention. Through the simple, deeply human tendency to send signals that say, we are still together, we are still moving, we are still okay. These signals feel like support. Sometimes they are support. But sometimes they are the sound of a group confirming an error because confirming is easier than questioning, and questioning feels like abandonment. The safest groups, the ones where people actually change course when course needs changing, are the ones that have learned to make it not just tolerable but expected to say, I think we are heading somewhere that does not serve us anymore. And that kind of environment is not built by one conversation. It is built by a long sequence of small signals, each one saying, your honesty will not cost you your place here. So what happens when you do know? When the information has arrived clearly, undeniably, and you have received it and understood it, and still, the behavior does not change? This is the question that tends to make people the most uncomfortable, because it strips away the comforting narrative that knowledge is the solution. If you just knew better, you would do better. If you just understood the mechanism, you would stop falling into it. But watch carefully what happens when someone learns about the way the mind protects its past investments. They nod. They recognize it in their own history. They say, yes, that is exactly what I have been doing, and then often they go back to doing it. Because recognition is not intervention. Understanding a pattern with the deliberate reflective part of the mind is not the same as changing the part of the mind that produced the pattern in the first place. The fast, automatic, deeply practiced part of human cognition does not pause for comprehension. It acts, and it acts before the slower, more careful reasoning has even finished forming the question. This is why knowing the name of what is happening to you is rarely enough to stop it from happening. The knowledge exists in one place. The behavior originates somewhere else, somewhere that moves faster than articulated thought, somewhere that has already decided before the thinking mind has arrived at its first complete sentence. And this matters enormously, because it means that the solution to persisting in error is almost never more information. It is a different kind of interruption. A pause not just in the thought, but in the momentum. A moment where the automatic machine that runs on past investment and identity protection gets enough friction to slow down. Not permanently, not completely, but enough. Enough to let the other part of the mind ask, is this still where I want to go? Here is the inversion that tends to arrive quietly, near the end of this kind of reflection, after the initial recognition has softened enough for something harder to get through. The error, the continued walking of the wrong road, the protection of the decision that should have been reconsidered, the elaborate architecture of justification, is not primarily a failure of information. It is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of what it would feel like to lose, and loss here does not mean losing the thing itself. It means the specific sensation of closing an account that has been running in the red for a long time, of officially writing down the cost of what was spent on something that did not work out. The mind does not process this as a financial calculation. It processes it as a verdict on the self. And verdicts on the self are among the heaviest things a person can hold, which is why so many people choose, without fully choosing, to keep deferring them. What this means practically is that the moment someone finally changes course, finally decides to stop, to recalibrate, to say out loud what they have known privately for longer than they are willing to admit, is almost never a moment of information. It is a moment of threshold. The cost of staying finally becomes more visceral, more immediate, more undeniable than the cost of admitting the loss, and at that threshold something shifts. Not because new knowledge arrived, because the emotional math finally cleared. This does not make the process rational, it makes it human. And understanding that it is human, that it is not a character flaw to have protected a failing path, but a predictable response to a very specific kind of internal pressure, does not make the pattern disappear. But it does change the quality of the looking. It makes it possible to watch the mechanism without needing to defend it or condemn it, to see it clearly, which is a different thing entirely from being free of it. There is something seductive about the idea that once you understand a trap, you are immune to it. That understanding becomes its own form of comfort, its own form of distance. You read about the way the mind protects its past choices, and you feel the recognition, sharp, a little uncomfortable, uncomfortably familiar, and then something very subtle happens. The recognition itself starts to feel like resolution, as if seeing the pattern from the outside means you are now operating from outside of it. As if naming what the mind does is equivalent to changing what the mind does. But these are not the same thing, and mistaking one for the other might be one of the more elegant traps available. Because now you are not just persisting in the old error, you are persisting in it while believing yourself to be the kind of person who sees errors clearly, which is in its own way a more sophisticated form of the same original problem. The pursuit of self-understanding, when it becomes performance, when it becomes a way of managing the image of the self rather than actually looking at the self, stops being a form of honesty and starts being a form of flattery. You are still protecting the story. You have just updated the story to include the part where you are the sort of person who knows about these things. This is not an indictment, it is a description. Because almost everyone who goes far enough into honest self-examination eventually finds this layer, the layer where even the examination has been quietly recruited into the defense, where the very act of reflection has been incorporated into the architecture of staying the same. The real work, if there is such a thing, is not adding more layers of understanding. It is learning to sit with the understanding without immediately turning it into something that makes you feel better about yourself, which is uncomfortable in a very specific way, not dramatic, not painful, just quietly, persistently uncomfortable, the way an honest conversation is uncomfortable right before it becomes the kind of conversation that actually changes something. Slow down for a second, not as a technique, not because there is a method here that if followed correctly produces a different outcome. Slow down because the speed at which you are moving through this, through your day, through your decisions, through the ongoing management of the story you carry about yourself, is part of how the machine keeps running. The automatic part of the mind requires momentum to stay in charge. It requires the next thing to arrive before the current thing has been fully felt. It requires the justification to follow so closely behind the decision that there is no visible gap between them, no space where a quieter question might get through. Speed is not just a feature of how we move through the world. It is in many cases a function of how the mind keeps itself from having to look too directly at what it is doing. And so the act of slowing down, genuinely, uncomfortably, without immediately filling the pause with analysis or planning or another round of self-examination, is not passive. It is, in fact, one of the few things that creates any real interruption in the mechanism at all, not because the slow moment is where the insight arrives, but because it is where the insight has enough room to matter, where the thing you already knew somewhere can finally reach the part of you that makes decisions. There is no formula for this. There is no reliable sequence of steps that produces it on demand. What there is sometimes is a moment of enough stillness that the distance between what you know and what you are doing becomes visible, not comfortable, not resolved, just visible. And visible is different from invisible, even when nothing else has changed yet. Because you cannot choose differently about something you cannot see. And seeing, really seeing, without the immediate protective reflex of justification or minimization or the reassurance that this time it is different, is harder than it sounds and rarer than most people realize and worth more than almost anything that comes before it. None of this ends cleanly. That is the part that tends to resist the way we usually want things to be delivered, wrapped up, concluded, with a clear before and after. But the mechanism we have been tracing does not work that way. It does not disappear when it is recognized. It does not stop being operational because you have spent time looking at it. It persists the way all deeply practicing persist, not because you are weak or unaware, but because it is old and practiced and woven into something that feels from the inside very much like who you are. What changes, maybe, is not the mechanism. What changes is the relationship to it, the possibility of catching it slightly earlier, the possibility of holding it a little more lightly, not with detachment, but with the specific kind of honesty that does not require you to be somewhere other than where you are. You are not free of the pattern. You are just perhaps a little less in the dark about it, and that slight shift in the dark, that small, quiet increase in what can be seen, is not a resolution. It is not a victory. It is something quieter than both. It is the beginning of a different quality of attention, one that does not demand a different story. One that simply watches the story as it runs, with enough steadiness to see where the story and the truth are not quite the same thing. You already knew something was off. You knew it before this video started. The question was never whether you knew. The question, the one that stays, the one that does not close when the screen goes dark, is what you are going to do with the knowing now that you can no longer say you did not have it.